there's been recent research about it in this country, is that actually quite a large proportion of the population has quite low financial literacy. They don't know, they don't understand about insurance, they don't understand about saving, they don't understand about investment, they don't understand about they don't understand even really how to use a bank account competently. So they are much more vulnerable because of this. I mean, they have much less control over their own life. I think what is true, definitely, is that the effects of pandemics on a society show very, very drastically how important financial literacy is for people to have any reasonable degree of control over their own lives. People who are doing all right under ordinary circumstances, but not doing very well, are put into a position in which they really can't cope at all under conditions of pandemic, because they have no elasticity and not enough precise understanding of how to handle financial things to be able to adjust to much more difficult circumstances. I mean, the more financially literate you are, the more financially flexible you can be. And under emergency conditions, and pandemics obviously are emergency conditions, flexibility is extraordinarily important. You can lose control completely over your life very fast under those circumstances. A very serious attempt being made in Britain at the moment to increase financial literacy. There are new institutions being set up to train people in it. And that is definitely an unequivocally good thing, because it enables them to take responsibility for their own lives. Because the society is organized to such a large degree through monetary exchange, it makes a great deal of difference to how much control people have over their lives, how well they understand how to use money, how to save it, how to get good value when they spend it, how to organize their income over time, and all of these things are skills, and obviously how to calculate accurately. All of these skills are ones which you can, in principle, learn in a school, or many people learn them actually in their home, in their own families. And some people are much quicker and much cleverer in relation to them than others. What ought to be true for really for every British citizen is they ought to have been given the opportunities in their schools to acquire a set of skills which will enable them to live a good life, a life which is satisfactory from their point of view. What is definitely true is that some of the schools in the country are quite good at providing those skills, and others are not so good. And obviously the schools which are good at it are very often in the wealthier parts of the country, and the schools which are bad at doing so are often in the poorer parts of the country. And it's probably fair to say that in the vulnerability of the British population in the face of the economic impact of the virus is greatly increased by the failure of government educational policy over the last 30 years or so. It's been very, very unsuccessful. It's not actually a failure on the part of one political party either. It is a general failure of the public educational sector. I think that had the schools been more successful, if they'd had more resources, if the teachers had been given more support, if they'd been better organized, then actually the population would be much better equipped to face a crisis like this. I think that is essentially an educational failure. You could say it's an educational failure in people's families to some degree, but it's very definitely an educational failure in the schools, and it extends up into universities. I don't think that British university students, most of them, are financially very intelligent. And it makes a lot of difference to your life how intelligent you are. You can plan your life over the decades, and you can have a family and raise it and look after it and send it off into the world in a state in which it can actually deal effectively with the world. If in fact your children or the children and adolescents in schools acquire those skills. I mean, there is different sorts of evidence about this for different societies. It's true, it's certainly true in Britain that female financial literacy is worse than male financial literacy on average. I think it's, for example, in African countries, not so. I think in African countries, it's often the case that financial literacy, in fact, is as widely distributed and as impressively present amongst the female population as the male population. A lot of African small-scale trading is done by women, and they're very good at it. I think that the modern communication techniques, I mean, the introduction of mobile phones into Africa has produced a very active sector of essentially borrowing and organizing finances on a very small scale. And certainly women have been as actively involved in that as men. And the evidence of economic evidence in Africa, and I think in Asia too, is that one of the most effective ways of actually improving the economic effectiveness of a population is to increase the proportion of women who are educated. In some upper class and middle class families in which the women don't actually work. This is partly a fact about the past, but now, because, or at least the proportion of people of that kind is much lower than it was. But in structures in which the males earn the family income and the women do not earn anything at all, it's quite common for the women to have no overall financial responsibility for the family. That pattern, I don't know, 75 years ago would have been probably pretty common across the whole society. But even then, there were always exceptions to it. There were families in which obviously the woman was a much more effective person than the man. And then some men were at least not intelligent enough to recognize that and to reorganize their lives accordingly. nowadays it is relatively uncommon for there to be families in which the male head of the family essentially controls all the resources of the family. That's pretty unusual now, but it's unusual because the proportion of the female population which is not working outside the home throughout their adult lifetime is quite small now. I mean, most women have incomes and occupations of their own for at least some portion of their adult lives. Some quite often still have interludes between forms of employment when they're rearing children, small children. But and the distribution of wealth and income between men and women is still distorted fairly strongly in favor of men. They don't. I mean, partly to have such habits, you need to start off from a position in which you have some control over your life. And a very big thing which has happened in the political history of the country in my lifetime is that when I was a child, when I was very young, the country established a welfare state which provided some sort of guarantee of security. It was intended to anyway, for every member of the population. And that is still, in some sense, there, but it's not as strong as it was then. And of course, the average living standard of the population is very much higher now. So people who are working with, let's say, the poorest third of the population, who either aren't working or are working on a very insecure basis, they don't have savings. I mean, they're very, very limited savings. I think it is true that the pressure to try to save has been less strong on people. People save in fear or in hope. And certainly the saving in hope is quite strong in the top third of the population, I would say, because they're in a position to do so. I mean, they have freedom to do so. Essentially, they're not actually in a condition of permanent need. The bottom third of the population are not in that position. Some of them are really have a terrible struggle in life every day. It would not look as terrible to a very poor Iranian as it does to them, because the average standard of living of the population has been much higher than in Iran for quite a long time. So it's a shock when things become much more difficult all of a sudden, as has happened with the pandemic. So I would say, you could say definitely two things about it, both of which are politically controversial, but they're both clearly true. One is that a large proportion of the population, as I said, maybe something like a third of the population, have a role in the economy which is either completely dependent, they're not actually contributing actively to the economy at all, but they have to live off it somehow, and so they depend upon an absolute minimal welfare provision by the government. That's what stops them from starving, but keeps them inside some sort of housing. But for example, there is a much larger number of people who are actually living in the streets now than was so 10 years ago. And that is a consequence of a series of government policies. Of course, it's also always true that it's a consequence of things, of actions by the people who are living in the street, but they don't. It's a failure in. It is a failure in state policy. It's not just a series of personal failures. Sometimes the personal failures are completely the fault of the people concerned, but very often I think they're not completely the fault. They're just a bit the fault of the persons concerned, and the third of the most prosperous third of the population certainly are just as often as at fault, but they're not at risk in the same way because of their faults. So there's a very, very sharp contrast in danger and in in opportunity. I think that it's fair to say that the long-term experience of the existence of a welfare state does provide for, does create a sort of culture in the least successful parts of the population, the poorest parts of the population, of not trying very hard, because in the end you will always be, to some degree, kept alive and kept fed. But that is a very dangerous structure to have come about, and of course it's not happened because the people in that part of the population have had a reasonably good set of opportunities. It's happened because they've had pretty poor opportunities, and they've become very discouraged by the poor opportunities. So you can look at it from both ends. You could look at it as a failure on the part of the government or of the politicians competing with each other to be the government, or you can look at it as a failure on the part of the people concerned. And in some cases, the relation between poverty and acting in a way which is foolish is quite a strong relation. In fact, you need to be braver and more intelligent and more persistent to have a good life if you start off low down than you do if you start off high up. Well, there's obviously the effects of the pandemic on people's economic life are very drastic. And they're also very unequal across the class structure and occupational structure of the country. I think what is much more important to understand for everyone, really, outside Britain and inside Britain, is that the effects are terribly much worse for people who can only work outside their homes, and which can't work online in the way that we are communicating now, and can't, and therefore, I mean, simply lose any role in the real economy. In particular, it will affect anyone who does not have a permanent employed job, and who and obviously it would affect people who previously had permanent employed jobs in firms which go out of business because they become bankrupt. There's a very high level of debt across the British economy now. Obviously, not everything's in debt. I mean, for example, the delivery companies like Amazon and the British counterparts, much smaller scale ones, these are very prosperous at the moment. They're making a great deal of money. But the whole proportion of the economy which is devoted to providing people with food and drink and entertainment, all of that is effectively completely shut down. And so a very large number of people are not actually in work at the moment. And some of them have very limited resources. They have very small savings, and the savings will disappear completely quite fast. And the amount of help which comes from the government budget is very unevenly spread across these categories, because it isn't legally formatted on a world like this. I mean, this is a very different situation from the situation it was created for and shaped for and aimed at. So, I mean, that is a terrible consequence, absolutely dreadful consequence of what's of the pandemic. And I think what must be most important comparatively, looking at a country like Britain from the outside, is how many of the population are essentially in sectors of the economy which are actually able to operate without direct physical transactions or concrete productive activities in factories or in shops, for example. And that is a large proportion of the population. I mean, I don't know how large, again, because the statistics aren't actually created to show something like that. But it must definitely be true at the moment, just this, because there is a total quarantine lockdown on the country.